What happens to our Z generation when their agency is so compromised? Their entire self is one big hollowed out vacuum, like a black hole. How do they make choices on behalf of their lives? What exactly is the stuff, the furniture that make up the contemporary self of our young people? What about our K through 12 schools? Are they learning domains, bastions of not just critical thinking, but substantive content that can set a child's soul on fire and help him or her navigate life's journey? Or are our teachers surrogate parents because the parents have morally outsourced their children to institutions of learning? Why are depression, suicidal ideation, anxiety, directionless, existential angst the highest they've ever been among our young people in the history of our republic? What's going on in the hallowed out homes of our children? Parents, who and where are you? Do you know how alienated your kids are? And do you know the degree of suffering that they're experiencing? And what's up with our democracy? How did our culture become so spiritually and intellectually bankrupt to such an extent that kids are in abject flight from it? Is there hope? Well, let's find out. I and my next guest will explore these issues and many, many more. This is Jason Hill, and you're listening to The Jason Hill Show. My guest today is Jeremy Adams, who is the author of a brilliant book called Hallowed Out, a warning about America's next generation. Jeremy Adams is a high school teacher at Bakersfield High School in California. He's also taught at the college level political science and economics, and he teaches government at Bakersfield High School. And this book is a fascinating book. It's one of the best books that I've read in a long time. I don't say this about all my guests, but I was riveted by this book because I, as a college professor, as you all know, I'm teaching the Z generation, as is Jeremy. Jeremy, welcome to the show.
Jason, thank you so much, and thank you for that wonderful introduction.
Well, let's get straight into this amazing book. We're going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about your teaching experience, your life with the students. We're going to whet the audience's appetite so we're going to not talk too much about the content of the book so that we don't disincentivize them from buying it, but enough of the book that will get them running to Amazon to buy it. But you state in the book that, and I'm going to read a quote from the book. I'm going to read a few quotes from the book. You say that while teachers strive to help students to become their best selves, many students don't feel inclined to become anything more than what they already are, because from their perspective, there is nothing to aspire to, no hierarchy of the good, and they can imagine no higher power than an anodyne God who asks nothing of them. How did young people get to this stage where when teachers such as yourself who embody excellence, where students do not feel that they can pin their aspirational identities on anything?
Well, I think what's happened, and one of the things that I really treasure about being a teacher is that we're not, those of us in the trenches of the American classroom today, we're not rich, we're not famous, we don't have blue check marks unless we want to pay for them now, I guess. But at the end of the day, the one big benefit is that we do see things a little bit earlier than everybody else. And one of the things that we've seen, and this is what that quote is really alluding to, Jason, is the fact that our young people have begun to live infinitely small lives. One of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I think it's probably because I'm getting older, and that kind of Grand Canyon separating me from my years of being youthful and the beginning of my life, is I keep thinking about what it felt like to be young. I keep thinking about what it felt like to be in love for the first time, what it felt like for the first time to really believe that there's a God who loves me and wants to have a relationship with me. I'm remembering what it's like to find your first real best friend, what it's like to encounter a book that changes your life. What it feels like the very first time your parents really, like you can remember what it was like to have them truly proud of you in a way that you could tell meant the world to them, that transcended any other thing in their life. I've been thinking a lot about those moments in my own journey. And I think what you're describing from my quote in the book is that young people don't really have these moments, and they're foundational for who we eventually become. And that's the thing that you ask what's going on, is that those moments simply are not there for a lot of our young people. And I think that it's morally impoverishing them, or, that's why I use the phrase hollowed out, is they're hollowed out of the values and the behaviors that are the foundation upon which we live meaningful lives.
Well, you also have an interesting chapter called Hollowed Out Culture. And it seems to me that if our young people are going to have a sense of pinning their aspirational identities on, let's say, a model, a heroic model, then there has to be a culture that is reinforcing this drive, this impetus. And you also state that an increasing percentage of young people have lost everything, lost interest in everything, in sports, in dating, in socializing. Let's talk a little bit about the cultural bankruptcy, or the bereft nature of our culture, which, because it would take a sort of spiritual giant really among our young people to sort of fight against the hollowness of the culture that you write about in order to be filled with a kind of spirit of plenitude. So say something about the nature of our culture that is so itself bereft, that is not sort of inspiring these students to fill the hollowness that they find themselves in possession of.
Well, it's interesting when you talk about culture, and when you study history. One of the things you quickly realize is that great civilizations aren't just great because they amass power, not just because they amass wealth. They're great because there's a certain quality of human beings that they produce. And so even if you go back to Homeric Greece and you read the Iliad and the Odyssey, and you find that there is a human model, there's a kind of exemplar, there's kind of a great man model, what they would call kind of agathos, the honor ethic. And of course, that's going to be a different kind of human being that we hold up than in aristocratic societies or in kind of more religious societies. But the point I'm making is that, every culture kind of has its model of the great man, the great woman. What do we aspire to be typically? Aristotle talks about how, the highest value of a society has to be perpetuated. So, in a democracy, we're supposed to be perpetuating people who have a real love of egalitarianism, hopefully kind of classical liberal egalitarianism, even though we can talk about their kind of egalitarianism today, I think is somewhat skewed off that path. But what's happened in our culture is that I think we have essentially, and I see this in our young people all the time, is that, Jason, we have conflated the qualitative value of being with the quantitative value of having. And when you conflate quality and quality, and you confuse the two, and you champion one and you diminish the other, you begin to see the kind of value system that's on display with young people. Where you see a kind of what I would say an unapologetic consumerism. One of the things that I've noticed a lot that's a little different the last 10 years is the first, maybe the first 10 years of my career. I've been teaching for 25 years now. People always want to be successful, right? People want to be, I teach the honors classes, and these are ambitious kids and they want to do something with their lives. But something I've really noticed in the last 10 years is this real pivot where students don't particularly care how they make a lot of money. They just want to make sure that they make a lot of money. They don't talk a lot about being lawyers or bankers or teachers or engineers. They certainly don't want to go into politics. But they want to be influencers without really giving a dang about what they're influencing. They want to have a lot of followers, but they don't really care where they're leading people to. And so that kind of, I think that corruption in the kind of moral and spiritual value system of young people is really, really strong. And I'll be honest. I mean, I don't want this conversation to be a big downer. I know that sometimes, the book is not, particularly uplifting. It is a warning. But I am noticing, and I think this is good news. I'm noticing that more and more people are becoming aware of, I call it radical individualism. I think some people also call it expressive individualism. And that is this kind of notion that, we embody this in all these expressions that just bug the crap out of me. Like when my students are like, when they quote opera and they're like, live your truth. Oh my goodness gracious. Or they're go live your best life. I don't know about you, but those kinds of expressions just bug the crud out of me, because it's really saying there is no higher. Like you yourself are the highest thing that's possible. So just go live that, go pursue that, go celebrate that. It's kind of the almighty me, ethos that you see in our culture. And so, I really see these things as really polluting the culture itself. But people are starting to wake up to it. And I'm seeing more and more kind of thoughtful pieces about, I think, kind of the bane of excessive individualism.
Well, there are two questions I want to ask you. One is, what are the antecedent causes that you could ostensibly point to for explaining why young people just don't care how they get rich, don't care how they make money? In other words, the traditional values that used to sort of bolster an attitude towards the pursuit of values like grit, tenacity, honor, delayed gratification, perseverance. Those I think what we're intimating is that those are lost today. Those are completely lost. When did those values, those virtues, really, the virtues of character, tenacity, grit, honor, delayed gratification, at what moment did those virtues become lost? That's the first question I want to ask you. In our culture, such that young people today, as you rightly said, because I've noticed it among my kids in the classroom, sort of dispense with inculcating or developing, having those virtues inculcated in them or developing those virtues.
Well, again, I think it's way, way, way above my pay grade to tell you the exact moment. But I will tell you that, to answer, but I will answer the question, which is, I think, first of all, you put your finger on it. But then I think we have to go back from what you put your finger on. You put your finger on the mitigating influences and mitigating institutions that make it so that things like grit and honor and integrity are these paramount values in a commercialized society. I mean, I had this fabulous professor in college who you remind me of, by the way, talking to you, just kind of the very cerebral, thoughtful way that you articulate yourself reminds me of him very much. And he always said that one of the most underappreciated books in Western civilization is Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments. He was a big believer that book had to be the companion piece to The Wealth of Nations, because, of course, one book really explores the self-interested element that leads to market economies, but the other one, of course, is the root of our moral sensibilities. And if you don't have a kind of moral foundation in society before you embrace a market system, then spiritual values are quickly going to be degraded into commercial values, and that's exactly what we've had. So, I think there are different theories about why it's happened. We've taken the kind of half of Adam Smith and left the important part of it. But you put your finger on it, which is that the relationships, connections, institutions used to act as a kind of mitigation tool against these excesses. And what I talk about, the way that I phrase it's a little differently. I would say that young people are really suffering from a profound dearth of adult relationships and adult influences. This is what is different and unique about our time. Again, one of the things that I hear if somebody wants to be negative or a detractor or come after me is that you hear the same argument over and over. Oh, well, every generation thinks the next one is just going to hell in a handbasket. And, even in ancient Greece, there was a term for the elderly, who were completely in a rut about the next generation coming up. You're no different. You're just a curmudgeon. You're a crank. You're howling into the wind. You're screaming, get off my lawn. The answer to that is no. That's absolutely not true. Things are uniquely perilous today because those young people today are growing up, many of them with one parent in the home. That parent maybe is working 2 or 3 jobs. Sometimes that parent goes through a series of relationships. I'm not talking, it could be a mother or a father, and they bring in somebody and they live with that person for a while. The stories that I tell people who are not in education about how often I have young men who go missing for a few days, and you'll say, well, where have you been? And he'll say, well, my mom's boyfriend has gotten violent and I'm kind of worried about him hurting my mom or my sisters. This is the kind of thing we're seeing. These are the kinds of adult influences that are there and are not there. 100 years ago, there's a good chance that a young person was growing up with 4 or 5 adults in the home, a mom, a dad, grandparents. And Jason, I'm a big believer that we are human beings. And as human beings, we learn by the examples in front of us. And either we are improved or depraved by those examples. And they're just simply not there in the home. Obviously, they're not there because people don't go to church anymore. Again, we can talk about that later. It's none of my business that my students don't go to church, but they don't even know anything about religion other than they think that it's judgmental and negative. But let me go back even more. I know this is a long answer. I'm sorry. But before the institutions and the relationships really began to be emptied out, I mean, I would argue, and again, I'm just a high school teacher. I don't teach at Harvard. I'm not an intellectual. But I would say that really this kind of postmodernism that really got perpetuated in the 60s, really it's taken a few decades for it to really get a lot of momentum. And I think it's reached a critical mass. And so nowadays you send kids off to college. I mean, I don't know about your college, but I have hundreds of former students and they're not reading Plato. They're reading a bunch of, postmodernism. They're reading Foucault like crazy. What they know about the founding fathers is that they're bad and they're phonies and they're, the racists. And a lot of the things they're exposed to is kind of this postmodernism that really doesn't give you this kind of transcendent sense of what the country and what yourself can be. And so I think that's really filtered down into the relationships.
Right. We're going to take a small break, and we're going to come back. When we come back, I want to ask you if you think part of what it's reinforcing the cultural relativism and the postmodern infusion and all its problems has anything to do with late-stage capitalism, which I'm not an enemy of capitalism, but we're going to take a short break, and we'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Jason Hill, and you're listening to The Jason Hill Show. My guest today is Jeremy S. Adams, who is the author of an amazing book called Hallowed Out, a warning about America's next generation. You should all get this book if you have children, if you're an educator, or if you're just really, really concerned about the next generation who will be in charge of handling our generation, taking care of us or not taking care of us, or if you just really care about the culture. Jeremy, we sort of left off at an interesting juncture. You were talking about postmodernism and the fact that young people are reading a lot of Foucault and I would say Derrida and Lacan and which comes with a kind of relativistic baggage. But I also want to ask you if you think that one of the reasons, perhaps, that there isn't a corrective to a lot of the malarkey that students are exposed to, and a lot of the absence of, let's just say, the vacuum in which people find them, these young people find themselves in, is because of late stage capitalism. Now, I'm not an enemy of capitalism. I believe in the free market. But when I say late stage capitalism, I mean the sort of capitalism that has rendered communities obsolete. There's a sort of obsolescence when we talk about communities as we knew them. Even when I came to America 37 years ago, there were still strong communities. There were still neighborhood churches. And it seems to me today that communities as we once knew them, neighborhood communities, are obsolete. And there was a latchkey kid phenomenon even after the late 70s, where there you had a two parent household, both parents working, kids let themselves in, but there was still a neighbor who could check on the children and make sure that they were fine, even fed them and so on and so forth. This kind of phenomenon is completely absent. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that. If you think that the absence or the obsolescence of communities as we once knew them is part of what's responsible for what you call in this very interesting chapter called hollowed out culture.
Yeah, no, I think that is something that, I'll be honest, I've really thought a lot about in the last 4 or 5 years. Something that maybe when I was younger, I definitely didn't pay that much attention to. I've never been a libertarian. I've always believed that there have to be that there's a role for government in society. I've always believed that if you're conservative, it doesn't mean you're anti-government. It means you're limited government. And in fact, the best government, you want good government, not just self-government, but you also want good government. But that typically means, localism. That means trying to make decisions as many as possible, as close to the people as possible. So I think that when you talk, what you're describing is definitely something that I'm seeing in the classroom. And it's funny when you talk about latchkey children. I mean, that you and I, that's a term to kind of describe my childhood. That first generation of young people where it was expected that both mom and dad would go to work, that there wasn't somebody at home for the kids. And what you're describing is the erosion of community. Now, some people would argue, and I think there have been people who've been making this argument since the 1970s, that people who believe in a kind of classical liberal society should not be surprised when individualism gets out of hand. That to a certain degree, the claims of the community and the claims of the individual are inherently antagonistic, and that capitalism really puts its finger on the individualism, which is really what I think you're talking about a little bit. But I would say to you that one of the things I think is really, really, really present in their lives is this kind of isolation. And I think where you're right is that capitalism has really kind of atomized the family. We all know that when the economy abruptly changes, that where people live has to change. Sometimes those jobs disappear overseas. We see this phenomenon right now in the wake of COVID that a lot of people who've been living in cities are now completely leaving, especially places like San Francisco and New York. That has to be, of course, disruptive to the family and to any sense of community. So I absolutely am much more sensitive to that idea than I was maybe even 5 or 6 years ago. But what concerns me, though, is just how isolating, Jason, it is for the young people. I mean, that you already have, and we haven't even talked about their technology at all, which, again, to me, a lot of people want to blame all of this on the technology. And I see the technology as making all of it worse. I mean, I think it makes everything worse in the schools, the learning, the mental health, the loneliness. It makes it all worse, but I don't think it's the cause. I think that was all, I know that it was already happening, and this just put gas onto the fire, as it were. But really, I do think that the kind of the late stage capitalism that you talk about has become very, very isolating of families and by extension individuals, and that kind of connection. I mean, you mentioned something that I think is really interesting, and that is, the notion of block parties, of neighborhood events, of the ability to feel that you kind of have this connection to your neighbor. You know their story, you know their children. It's a tragedy and it's a surprise when they move away, because nowadays I think people confuse a home from a house. Everybody lives in houses nowadays, but people don't make those houses into their homes because there's that lack of moral grounding in it and permanence. And I think that's essentially what you're talking about, and I largely agree with it.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the technological addictions, because it seems to me that if you had communities that were intact and you had games and you had activities that could fill children's lives, the addiction might not be there. But here's a conundrum that I face that I want to ask you about, since you definitely deal with the K through 12 individuals. A lot of my students uh, tell me, Jeremy, that they're exhausted, that they're overly scheduled. I mean, I teach at DePaul, and a lot of my, not all of them are rich, but a lot of them are affluent students who come from the affluent suburbs, and they say to me, "We're exhausted by the time we get to college because we have violin lessons, we have soccer classes." Their parents are doing everything that they can do to what to make them eligible candidates for Harvard and Princeton and Yale while they're in the K through 12 system. Now, why is it that these kids are overly scheduled? Their lives are filled with a plethora, multiplicity of activities: swimming, violin, foreign languages, and yet these are the same kids who cannot wait to get on their devices. Is it that? What, help me out with this, because I'm trying to understand if their lives are filled with extracurricular activities, are they not are they not enjoy, they seem not to be enjoying these activities, right? They seem to be, what are they finding these activities boring, numbing, alien to their sensibilities? Um, so I'm thinking that if we had a scenario in which young people's lives, I should say, are filled with activities that are vitalistic, fill them with vitality and joy, then the lure of these devices would sort of subside. But that doesn't seem to be the phenomenon at all.
No, what you're seeing is, and I will help you a little bit. I think I understand this pretty well. And this is true of two kinds of students. You describe a very specific kind of student that, frankly, I see them a little bit, not a ton, which is the highly regimented, very involved. Sometimes we call them lawnmower parents or helicopter parents, planning every moment of every day, making sure that the trajectory towards the Ivy League is as clear and as painless as possible. And that's definitely one kind of student who you see, just dying to get on their devices. I would tell you that's probably maybe 5% of American teenagers, though. Most teenagers are not overly scheduled like that. In fact, a lot of them especially after COVID, you see the death of a lot of activities, a lot of sports teams. They're just not joining the way they used to. But in both cases, though, and this is where I think I can be helpful, in both cases, those devices are a form of self-soothing. And to a certain degree, what they're doing is no different than what, frankly, I think a lot of us do. We always talk about, do as I say, not as I do. And I think that many of us adults have these same battles. I mean, I've noticed this about myself, which is if I'm standing in line at the grocery store or the bank, instead of just letting my mind roam, instead of just kind of looking around me, noticing things, thinking, reflecting, imagining, praying, which, I feel like we should do a lot more of sometimes, especially this part of the year. I feel that I'm just constantly trying to keep boredom at bay. And I think that's what's happening with a lot of these young people is that they scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and scroll and hours and hours and hours. And I think sometimes they're mildly amused. But I think by and large, it is just a form of self-soothing. And something else I want to mention to the audience, I think this is really important for people to understand as well, is that the real problem with the devices, even though I think it has killed our attention span. I mean, that's one thing. They just absolutely can't focus. There was a study among college students recently that showed that the average college student can focus for 91 seconds. I find this in my own life that I can't read deeply the way that I could 10 or 15 years ago. Again, that's my fault. And I don't spend anywhere close to the amount of time on a device as young people do. But I think the really, really pernicious part of these devices, though, and is that they never allow the kids to really be away from the drama of their lives, right? So it follows them home. When you and I, as latchkey kids, were growing up, if we had a bad day at school, you go home and you get away from the teacher who yelled at you. You get away from the kid who's kind of bullying you on the basketball court. You get away from your drama. And you go home and you have your family, or you have your neighborhood, or you have, you watch the Wonder Years at night or whatever, and you kind of recuperate. Again, I very much think of growing up in America today like a boxing ring. You got to get up and you go to work, or you go to school every day, and it's like boxing. But what happens with boxers? When boxers are done every day or every round, they go into their corner and there's 2 or 3 people there. And they give them some water and they kind of rub their neck and they talk them up and they say, do this, do that, and then they go back into the boxing ring. Well, imagine if there was nobody in your corner. Imagine if there's nobody there giving you advice or loving you or giving you water. All you have is not the ability to find any kind of soulful nourishment. No. All you can find is just simply getting away from it all, keeping boredom away, keeping your mind off of your troubles. And that's where the devices, I think, fill the gap. And they don't do it in a helpful way.
Right, they don't. And this thing of soothing is going to sort of segue me into another question, which is, you talk a lot in your book, which I appreciate, about the benefits of a two-family household. And there have been numerous studies, of course, that show that children that come from a two-family household are less likely to fall into delinquency, suicide, and so on and so forth, and are just healthier children. But there is also the idea, I think, and I see it even among students across the country when I give talks, and even I've been a professor now for 25 years, taught at 5 universities. Even those students who come from two-family households, who I think when you and I talked recently, I mentioned that these students are sometimes in my office till 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, bawling their eyes out, telling me things that they can't tell their parents. And these are kids from two-family households. And it's like they said, it's talking to my parent. I can't talk to my mom or dad about that. It's like talking to a brick wall. So I tend to be sometimes quite hard on the parents. I mean, I don't know if I read it in your book or read it in a report, but the average time that parents spend with their children is about 30 minutes. And you wrote a section in your book where you gave a talk where I heard you say that the kids take their dinner trays to their bedrooms and they're on their devices. The parents are working or sitting before the TV. Families don't have dinners together. So back to this soothing, the devices being soothing. This is a long question, but where are the parents? I mean, how much responsibility do you put on these parents? I mean, even in the two-parent household family, it seems that the kids are still suffering. They are still lonely. Why is it that what is it? What's the parent dynamic between the parent and the children, such that these I mean, I went to my mom for every damn thing, and she sometimes told me, "Man up," and then she would come back and say, "Sweetheart, what's going on? I mean, I'm sorry you're going through this." And my grandmother was there, and she would say, "This is just awful. I mean, I know how you're feeling. I mean," but I went to my dad when he was around, and my parents are divorced, And he would go to my school and tell my teachers, "Don't you dare talk to my son that way." What has changed?
Well, again, this is going to be a long answer, so feel free to cut me off.
No, I won't cut you off. I want to hear this.
There's so much I want to say about this. Excuse me. The first thing, though, and this is really important, is that I think a lot of people think that I wrote Hollowed Out exclusively from the perspective of a frustrated middle-aged teacher, and that's largely true. That is largely true. But I will also say that I've written this book as a parent, as a father who has made big mistakes when it comes to giving devices too early, when it becomes allowing them to be exposed to social media way too early, not being aware of maybe just how ridiculous, some of their expectations are at school. And when I mean expectations, I mean low expectations, not getting much homework. So I wrote the book not just because of my frustrations as a teacher, but also as a dad. And I just want to say very clearly that I'm going to sound really, really defensive for that reason. But I'll tell you, I think that it is, two things are true at the same time. The first thing is we might be the worst generation of parents ever. At the same time that I think it is the hardest it has ever been to raise a human being ever. And so however people want to weigh that, who are listening to this, if you want to say, well, yeah, it's really hard to be a parent, so you can't blame the parents. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it is our responsibility no matter how hard the world is. So let me start with this, the things that you mentioned. Yes, parents are just simply not putting themselves in the mental, moral, and physical space of young people like we used to. One of the things that's become really tragic in America is that we don't eat together. There was this great study that came out of Harvard that talked about all the benefits that exist when families sit down and eat together. The word they used was bonanza. There's a bonanza of benefits. The kids are less likely to do drugs. They're more likely to do well in school. They're more likely to volunteer, in charitable events. I mean, like the list is so long. What happens when you sit there and you eat together? And of course, like so many things in the book, how did I discover that it wasn't happening? I wasn't doing research. I was talking to my students. And I used the phrase, Jason, I said, the family dinner. And they all looked at me like I was smoking something. And I said, the family dinner. They're like, what are you talking about, Mr. Adams? I said, at night, where your mom or your dad make dinner and you sit down and you eat it. And they looked at me like I was nuts. They're like, we don't do that. I'm like, well, what do you do? They're like, well, I microwave some food and I go to my room. I said, well, what does your mom or your dad do? Well, they get in front of the TV or they're working late. So, I mean, just really, and we now spend here, how's this? And by the way, again, something else I'm guilty about. So again, I'm not, in no way am I, saying that I'm an exemplar. We now spend more money on fast food in America than we do on groceries. I mean, I think that says a lot about how we're spending our time. So you don't have the family meal. The other thing I've noticed that I think is really important, and I'm sure we'll talk about politics a little bit more here in the second half of our interview here, but young people just don't talk to adults about politics anymore. They're getting their information, they're getting their worldview from these algorithms on their social media. When I first started teaching, political science classes back in the early 2000s, and you were talking about current events or whatever, kids were constantly saying, oh, my dad says this, or my mom says this, or, my older brother says this. Nobody, and I mean almost nobody, ever mentions mom or dad or uncle or grandparent or pastor anymore, ever. They never talk about it. And many of them, by the way, will tell you that they are terrified to voice a political opinion because they don't know who's out there. They don't know what's going to be posted about them. They don't know what's going to be said about them. So they're not talking to their parents because they're not simply around their parents. I mean, I know nobody wants to hear this, but I'm sorry, but LeBron James has more influence on the worldview of a lot of people than mom and dad do, because that's who they're spending their time with. And of course, the fact that you don't have a personal relationship with the people who are influencing you, think about how dangerous that is. Because at least with mom and dad, maybe mom and dad have really crazy opinions, but at least they love you and they think that those opinions are going to help you in life. I don't trust celebrities. I don't trust influencers. And so that's the first part of this is just the parents are simply not in the space the way that they used to. Now, the second half of my answer, and I know this is long, but this is also very important, and I'm going to sound defensive. But I think what you're really seeing in parents today is parents are exhausted we are exhausted, Jason, because we're just trying to raise, at least I can speak for myself, I'm just trying to raise a normal human being with normal values and a normal outlook, and who is kind and pleasant and a good citizen with traditional aspirations for life. And what we have to compete, like I know that this is such the case that I think what's happening in places like Virginia with Glenn Youngkin and all of the kind of pushback against public schools is that I think during COVID, a lot of parents thought, you know what, these schools are not on my side. They're not making my job easier. They're not reinforcing my values. They're competing with it. Now, I don't buy into that, by the way. And I know I'm pretty conservative most of the time. I'm not on the conservative side there. I think 95% of teachers try their best. They are on the side of parents, but they're not on libs of TikTok, right? They're not on Fox News. And so they're not getting that kind of coverage. But I think broadly speaking, parents are tired of competing with the phones and the culture and Hollywood and athletes and Colin Kaepernick and all of it, just trying to produce a normal generation of young people. And I feel that all the time. I remember getting into and my daughter will never listen to this podcast, so I can say this. I remember driving my daughter home when she was about 15 years old. And she's like, so Dad, capitalism, like really, is that really any better than communism? Like really? And I about drove off the road. I'm like, well, it ain't perfect, but it's I have 100 million people who died who would tell you it's probably a little bit better. But that's, and like, well, where are you getting that from? Well, again, it's all these posts after post after post. And we all know TikTok is dangerous. We all know that the Chinese give us the really dangerous version of TikTok, not the good version of it that they give to their own citizens. So I know that's a long answer.
So how do parents become or restore themselves as the primary moral epicenter in their children's lives? Because it seems like it's been replaced by celebrities, certainly by the educational system, and they're constantly fighting with their parents. My teacher said this, or I heard Kim Kardashian say this. I know it's a tough job, but how do parents become the primary moral source, not just of information, but the primary source in their children's lives, where their children look primarily to their parents for moral instruction? Yeah.
Well, what I would say is, first of all, I mean, what you're asking for here is the Holy Grail, and I think it's a fair question and it's a good question. But I want to be very explicit in my answer here, which is that there is absolutely, positively no questions asked, no easy solutions to the hollowing out of our children. Like people want a 3-point talking 3 points in a memo. What are we going to do now? But so none of these things are easy, but I do think that they're obvious. And this is one of the things, Jason, kind of go back to the last question. I think it says something about our culture that you and I actually have to say this out loud to people, but you actually have to say it, which is our children need to be raised. Like they don't, they don't come ready-made. And I think this is one of the things that bothers me so much. It makes me want to cuss. I'm not going to cuss on your podcast, my friend. But I am so sick and tired of adults elevating children for their own causes. Sometimes it's political. Sometimes it's moral. Sometimes it's commercial. But let's stop infantilizing everything. Let's make adulthood laudatory. Let's make it good. Let's aspire for maturity. Let's talk about the great things about being a man or a woman, not a child. And I think that when you talk about the glory of adulthood, the good things of adulthood, I think that would do a lot to really kind of help young people start to listen to the adults that are in their lives. I remember there is I think there's a great passage in C.S. Lewis where, it's trying to, he was talking about how, the glories, the splendors that await us are impossible for us here to sometimes understand, like, because we have to incarnate, words and concepts that can't really apply to what's coming for us. And I think the same thing sometimes is true for young people. It's hard to explain to a 14 or 15-year-old the glory of what it means to love somebody deeply for their life in a marriage, or what it means to have a child who, the word love is not big enough to describe that relationship. But at the end of the day, to answer your question, it's not fancy. We have simply got to talk to our young people again. There was a study many years ago where the thesis was that parents who volunteer at schools, those students are going to do better in academics, right? Because they see their parents at the school, they're in the PTA, they're actively involved. And what they found was that wasn't necessarily the case. That what they found was that the one thing that can do the most good for your child is to have one good conversation a day. That's it. You don't need to get fancy. You don't have to go be president of the PTA. You don't have to go be a band booster. No, go do it. That'd be great. But really what you need to do is have one good conversation with your teenager a day. And by the way, it doesn't have to be on anything of real substance. It could be about sports, or it can be about celebrities, or it could be about, neighborhood gossip. It doesn't matter. But that kind of connective tissue, it ameliorates the sensibilities of our young people more than anything else does. So, again, we have got to go back into the space of our young people and be a mom. Don't be a friend. Be a teacher. Don't be a friend. Be a minister. Don't be a friend. Be an old, again, be friendly, be kind. But there's I think, friendship is predicated on a relationship of equality. And sometimes, I don't want an equal relationship. I want a parent to have authority. I want a teacher to have authority. I want those kind of authoritative relationships to really take root in the lives of young people, because they're just simply not there.
That's right. We're going to take another final short break, but I think this is so right, because I think when I get my students, especially my freshmen, and I tell them you're wrong, they give an answer, and I said I'm very emphatic in a gentle way. I said that's just not correct. They're actually surprised, and it seems to me that I wouldn't say this to them, but it seems like they have come from a system in which their sophomoric high school opinions have been elevated to the level of human knowledge that nobody has ever told them that they were, or very few people have told them that they're wrong. I mean, this might have emerged from the self-esteem movement of the 1980s, where, you make a child feel good about every utterance that comes out of his or her mouth. And I think having a good conversation, as you said, is proper. A substantive conversation in which you can actually be a good conceptual instructor and provide correction to viewpoints that are just flawed. So I want to talk a little bit more about that. We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue the final segment of our conversation with Jeremy Adams, the author of Hallowed Out, a warning about America's next generation. Be back in a moment. Welcome back to the show. I'm Jason Hill, and this is the Jason Hill Show. We are talking to Jeremy S. Adams, the author of Hallowed Out, a warning about America's next generation. And Jeremy, one of the things that you said right before we took the break was about having, it really, really struck me, because it's something I can really resonate with, having just one meaningful conversation with a young person. It could be about anything, but having a meaningful conversation, which is, I take it, not meeting, so-called meeting the students where they are, not sort of trying to be hip and cool, but really, in some sense, strengthening the conceptual capabilities, strengthening the minds of the students by importing in that conversation something not just of value, but something that is factual, something that is true, something that will inspire them to think, to provide something that is contentful, for out of which they can apply their critical thinking skills. Right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, and I think you put like again, you put your finger on it. I think right before the break, where you talked about the self-esteem movement, and again, I think a lot of these things, we can trace them, kind of the embryonic state of them to years earlier. But I think sometimes it takes decades for really that momentum, that inertia to pick up. I mean, we've talked a lot about the kind of moral latent relativism. And again, it's been out there, but I think it really picked up steam in the last 10, 15 years, even though you really saw kind of the explosion of it even in the 60s. But I think the self-esteem movement really has had a really pernicious effect on the classroom, because it changed the fundamental calculus of how a relationship between a teacher and a student works in such a way that, some of my greatest teachers wouldn't recognize the classroom. And so what am I talking about? Well, it was always very clear to me growing up, and you and I have not talked about this, but I'm about 99% certain you're going to agree with this, which is that it was very clear from my parents, my teachers, my coaches, that if you want to feel good about yourself, you want to celebrate you, that's fine, but you dang well better achieve something first, right? So you want to walk tall, you want to have a little swagger, okay, that's fine. We can all be Joe Namath a little bit from time to time. That's fine. But what have you better go win some games. You better go win some trophies. You better go get some A's. You better go be a good person. You better go do something that really justifies a little bit of the pride. And I think what we have now is the pride, the vanity, the ego, the ridiculous levels of self-esteem, which I think have bred a lot of entitlement in young people. I mean, the kind of entitlement that is shocking, I think, to normal adults. It's because we have misconstrued the order of things. We think that, we've lied to ourselves and said, well, if kids feel good about themselves, then they're going to go out and achieve things. And I think that that's wrong. I think young people have said, I already feel good about myself. Why do I need to prove it? You've already told me how great I am. I'm already justified. And by the way, I would argue, and I'm going to be maybe a little controversial here, but I'm just going to say it. I think that kind of ego, that kind of pride, and of course it's not real ego, it's not pride, it's juvenile pride, but it still manifests itself in very dangerous ways on a campus. When you go to a campus nowadays and you hear the utter profanity, you see how disrespectful students are, you see how they're rude to their teachers, that's the embodiment of it. And so it used to be that the impetus was on the young person to impress the teacher. Now, even among some of my best students, the real sense is you, Mr. Adams, you're here to serve me. My parents pay taxes, and you're the teacher, and you're supposed to serve me. And if you don't, I'm going to let you know it. Which my father, who is maybe the greatest teacher I ever knew before college, my father wouldn't recognize the classroom. He passed away just a little bit over a year ago, and he was hardcore. You don't wear hats in his class. You don't chew gum. No excuses for being late. I don't want to hear about, you don't have a ride or mom's mad at you. Find a way to make it happen. That just would not make it today. And I think it's because of that ordering of pride and esteem.
Yeah, it's a generational thing. I want to move into a positive direction, because your book is not just an apocalyptic indictment of our hollowed out homes or hollowed out culture. There's a lot of hope here. And we started off the interview talking about many students don't feel inclined to become anything more than what they are because there's nothing to aspire to, no hierarchy of goods. But you also, Jeremy, talk about a very moving section in the book where students, I think, cried because or were moved by the fact that you were the only person in their lives who made them feel that they were worth something, or you had high expectations of them, and they weren't getting this from home. They were getting this from you. And it seems to me that this is why I love young people. I mean, I love teaching them, as frustrating as it is, and increasingly is becoming so, is because, and you can't write them out of history. You can't write them off, because at the same time that on the earlier part of the book, you mentioned that there's nothing for them to aspire to, and there's nothing, at the same time, they are hungry for someone such as yourself who will hold them accountable to the best, what I would call the best within themselves, to constantly cajole, inspire, needle them to to realize their highest potential. And we see this kind of dichotomy existing in the student, right? There's one, in one sense, they're living in hollowed out homes, hollowed out culture, hollowed out democracy. But at the same time, they have a Jeremy Adams, and I would like to think that I serve that role in my students too. That is going to say, no, you're not a failure. You can become something remarkable. You can achieve some remarkability in your life. And that's the hopeful part of your book that I found very, very, very moving. I wonder if you could speak to those two seemingly irreconcilable states of tension that don't seem irreconcilable at all, because you have made a difference. You have had students who have been moved by your relentless drive to make them realize the high potential that they carry within themselves.
Well, I don't know if I can say it any more beautifully than you just did. That was very, very well said, and quite eloquent. But I will say, one of the things that I've really come to appreciate as a teacher is that sometimes we need to realize as teachers that we're not in a sprint, we're in a marathon. And that the way that a teacher looks in the moment is sometimes very different than the way that they look 10 years or 20 years later. And I think that, sometimes that teacher who got on you, that teacher who was annoyed that you skipped class, that teacher who kind of gave you the look when you got a C minus when they know that you could have gotten an A minus, that teacher who, asked the difficult questions. I mean, I would tell you, I think the greatest teacher in Western civilization was Socrates, and he didn't have any portable wisdom, but he was filled with questions. And I think that questions make us uncomfortable sometimes because they make us realize that there is this profound, titanic, Herculean chasm between who we are and who we want to be, between the world we have and the world we want. And I think that teachers kind of make us recognize that kind of Grand Canyon between those ideals and those realities. And so I think that, what you're alluding to are those students who do realize that high expectations are a form of affection. It's cool to have a hip, chic, avant-garde teacher with a couch in the back that doesn't believe in homework and really wants to be edgy and wants to cuss in class a lot, and that's really cool when you're 15 or 16 years old. But you know what? What's cool when you're 35 or 45 or 55? It's the teacher who turned you on to the magic and the majesty of a subject. It's the teacher who truly made you believe that you were better than what you thought you were. It's what I call the rear view mirror test, is that you don't want to judge a teacher by what's in front, how they look right now. How do they look in the rear view mirror of your life 20, 30 years later? And so you're right. There's a lot of potential for great things here. Our young people, there is nothing inherently, innately wrong with them. It is, and by the way, let me be very clear, and hopefully everybody hears me loud on this. This is our fault. Their problems are not because of them. They didn't choose to be born in this time period, in this civilization with these issues. That's not their fault. That's us. We've got to be the ones that take responsibility and grab the mantle here, because there's a lot that's great about these young people. One of the things that is frustrating but also magical is that they do have a thoroughly American view of justice. I mean, they might not know it. They play games with critical race theory, and they play games with kind of the word salad that we like to perpetuate in modern universities. But you know what? You know what they believe? They believe in the 14th Amendment. They believe in the Declaration of Independence. They believe in Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail. That's really what they believe in. And so it's kind of interesting that these kids who have a thoroughly American view of justice and society are the least likely to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. But that's a short-term issue. That's not a long-term issue. That's a habitual problem, not a structural problem. They are ambitious. They want to make global changes, not kind of parochial changes. Now, I would say sometimes to students, it's fine you want to deal with global warming and climate change and all that. That's fine, but make sure you're not going to the UN. You know what? Organize something on your campus. Do something local. Again, localism is where you get meaning in your lives. And again, I also think that there's good news in the sense that I think that adults are figuring it out. You're starting to even see things in the New York Times talking about, the absolute crisis of anxiety and self-harm and suicide and eating disorders. You're starting to see publications in England talking about what phones have done to our attention spans. And most of all, I'll tell you, in the classroom, I think that there is a real movement now to get rid of the cell phones in classes. I think that teachers are realizing that we should not be competing for their attention. We should be greedy for their attention. And phones have completely undermined these young people for a decade. And I think there really is a real sense of responsibility that we've got to do something about it. So you're right. There's a lot that's good. And I think that maybe we're in the embryonic state here. And I'm not saying, I wish I could say my book had something to do with it. I don't think my book had anything to do with it. I do think it was right a little bit earlier than what most people have finally come around to. So I'm very, very thankful for that.
And you end the book on without giving too much away, because like I always say to my guests that we don't want to give too much of the book away, because we want to incentivize people to read it. We want to talk around the book, which is, I think, what we've been doing. But you do really, really end on a wonderful note that, where you talk about we have almost a mandate, ethical responsibility to remind our young people of the obvious things about our country. But we must do this. And I love the fact that you talk about we must show these possibilities through love. You're not talking about a kind of saccharine, sentimental kind of love where, we started out talking about a kind of self-esteem movement kind of love, a kind of syrupy kind of love. What? Just briefly tell our readers, our listeners, what is the kind of love and compassion that is not saccharine, that is not lugubrious, that accompanies this teaching of endless possibilities to our young people?
I think that it is a form of love that is rooted in what I consider to be the essential insight of our existence, which is that life is a gift. And at the end of the day, the things that allow us to see the different manifestations of this gift come in the form of love. A love of family, a love of community, a love of nation, a love of our friends, a love for learning, love in all of its form. It really is kind of the high water tide mark of the human condition. And one of the things that really has been, that I've realized in the last few years is that it's kind of hard as I'm now 46 years old, Jason, and I've been married for almost 23 years, and I have 3 children, and I've lost parents, and I've lost friends, and I've been sick, and I've read books, and I've achieved some dreams, and I've come up really short in a lot of my dreams, and that creates a kind of substance of the soul that you really can't articulate to a 15-year-old. But what you can do, what I hope that real education does, is it alerts them to the possibilities of grandeur, the possibilities of enchantment, to tell them that, I can't tell you exactly what it feels like to be 46 years old or 56 years old, or I can't tell you what it's like to find God or to lose faith, but I can tell you that there are plenty of splendorous moments that await those who are looking for them. That, to me, is love. The belief that life is good, that splendor is possible, but that at the end of the day, you have to look up from your phones. You have to engage your fellow man. And if you do that, then the best is yet to be.
Well, Jeremy, This has been a wonderful conversation. We're going to have you back on to talk about the virtues of magnanimity, the role of faith and church, and a stronger role of family. We've exhausted so much, but we're going to give readers a chance to buy more copies of your book, and definitely have you back on. And I want to thank you for being a gift to humanity, and what you're doing in your world of teaching and reaching minds, and not just reaching minds, but reaching the hearts and souls of our young people, and more importantly, for absolutely not giving up on our young people. It's something that too many people are writing off our young, the members of the Z generation, writing them off as hopeless, as dead, and you are not doing that, and that's a magnificent virtue that you are